everyone should be able to see my screen. I'll run a very quick 5-minute presentation and then Tom is going to take over. So first of all, thanks for everyone for joining us today on this very interesting talk. We're going to discuss data privacy and GDPR, two topics which are very popular and very important for any data professional as well as entrepreneurs. This event is organized by the Tesseract Academy, and the Tesseract Academy's mission is to help decision makers and leaders better understand and implement emerging technologies. Our focus is mostly on artificial intelligence and data science, but we also run programs and provide services in other areas like blockchain. And we work a lot with entrepreneurs, but also bigger organizations. Here you see some testimonials from entrepreneurs we've worked with in the past, and here are some of the companies that we've worked with and we're still working with, including some universities like UCL, London Business School, and big corporates like Vodafone, but also many startups. So whether you're a solo entrepreneur, a startup, or a manager or CEO of a bigger organization, we can definitely help you improve your understanding of this space, the space of data, the space of technology, especially emerging technologies. And we not only we run educational programs, but also coaching programs, and we provide implementation services. So if you were who I am, I'm going to be your host and moderator for tonight. I'm the CEO of the Tesseract Academy. I've been in the space of data science for my whole career. I've written up a book on that topic, which I'm more than happy to share with anyone who sends me an email to this address. Among other things, I'm an advisor in various companies, and I'm also affiliated with some institutions like London Business School, UCL, and Charles Business School. So today, Tom is going to be our guest speaker, who is a partner of the Tesseract Academy. And Tom has more than 40 years of experience working as a consultant in technology, and a large part of his career has been around data and data privacy and regulations. So now I will stop sharing my screen and I will leave it over to Tom and his very interesting presentation. The presentation will run for about 20 minutes. And after that, there's going to be a Q&A. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to share this in the chat. So now I'm going to stop sharing and the stage is yours, Tom.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for attending, and thanks, Stylianos, for arranging this this talk tonight. The subject of GDPR, which is the latest incarnation in terms of data protection, really you need to go back to the fundamentals of what is data. So if you think of GDPR as a regulation that applies to data and personal data in particular, then you always go back to this concept of data. Now, the analogy I always like to use is a bit like regulation or compliance in terms of driving a car. So you basically got various rules and regulations in terms of what you can do on the road, but you've also got to be able to drive the car in order to make sure that you either don't get any fines, banned from driving, or to actually prevent harm to yourself. So GDPR is basically, it started off and still is an EU regulation that applies to personal data.
Sorry, Tom, if you can't see your screen, just wanted to let you know in case you're sharing.
Oh yeah, actually, Stylianos, can you run the screen, because I've got technical problems here, so I'm having to use my phone because there's an issue with the Wi-Fi and the laptop. So
okay,
I don't know.
No worries. I sympathize. Okay, so let me. I guess you give me a second, and then I'll share my screen. Apologies, everyone. Yeah, so now you should be able to. Okay, so which slide are we at?
If you start off with the next one, the next slide.
Okay, perfect.
And then when I've finished with it, I'll just give you a nod and then just move into in the next slide. So as I was summarising just now, what we need to do in terms of finding out about GDPR, and we've only got 20 minutes, so it's very much a quick run of some points that you can absorb without going into too much detail as time limits says in that way. So basically, we're going to talk about what is data, what is personal data, then about GDPR, again, very high level, how to comply with GDPR, and how to understand what data you process, because this is the key. The simple formula is, the more you know about your own data, the more easily it is to comply with GDPR. So depending on what industry you are, how old the industry is, how old your company is, some latter companies that have been set up with latest technology, cloud technology and so on, then they tend to have very integrated and secure processes. Other organizations, for example, I do some consultancy within the NHS in the UK. They've got a host of fragmented systems, and therefore tracking the data across those myriad systems, banks are probably another example, is more difficult. So I'll just touch on all of those points at a high level and just try and give you some pointers to absorb as one. So next slide, please, Stylianos. Okay, so we're just going to, as I probably alluded to, we're going to understand what personal data you process, what your processing role is, and what the obligations are. Okay, Stylianos. Okay, so the first question is, what is data? Now, there was an interesting, I can't remember exactly which year it was, but The Economist, I remember a few years ago, said that data was now the most valuable asset, more than, I think, gold, and certainly more than oil. So data is actually an asset to an organization, and no organization really, even if you're in a very heavy manufacturing industry, can exist without data. So in other words, if you put GDPR and data protection compliance to one side and it never existed, then there would still be a need to make sure, because it's a commodity. So if you think of data as similar to money, and you apply the same sort of controls in that way, then not only is it better from a business perspective because you're on top of your own data and therefore can be more efficient, but also it means that you're not falling foul of data protection GDPR regulation, which is basically saying, this is how I think you should manage your data from a security, lawful point of view in order to protect the data subject. And the other thing I would say, the other quick sort of thing to put in the back of your mind is that, since we're using a financial analogy, is that the data that you process actually doesn't belong to you if it's personal data. It actually belongs to the data subject, just in the same way that if you have a bank account and you put some money into that bank account, then the money always belongs to you, even though it's being processed and managed by the bank. So that's just one thing that you always confuse a lot of people, because they tend to think that the company has this data and it belongs to them. But it's not actually owned by the company. It's always under the control of the data subject. So the challenge is really, in terms of data in particular vis-a-vis GDPR, is that technology's moved on so much that data is now being processed on phones, it's being processed in myriad different ways. Whereas in the old days, when I first worked into IT, you might have a massive great mainframe and you could lock everything down. Obviously, you didn't have the advantages in terms of the benefits of that data in terms of analytics, reporting, and so on. But from a control point of view, it was very easy for IT departments. But with modern technology and the use of mobile technology and so on and so forth, data is far more distributed. So the challenge is, it's almost a contradiction in the sense that GDPR is wanting to put more control in, when in actual fact, it's harder to control the data in the sense that it can be processed in myriad different ways in a non-distributed way. Now, personal data, as in terms of the definition, to subdivide it from data in its general sense, is any data that can identify an individual. So it might sound easy, well, it's somebody's name, but it can be any combination of bits of data that says, I know who that person is. So it could be parts of an address and somebody's age. It might not have the name, but you could identify the person based on that combination of data items. So personal data is anything that can identify an individual, and that is what GDPR covers. Okay, Stylianos? Okay, so I alluded to this earlier on. So I think this is the actual quote that I was struggling to find the date of. May 2017, saying that the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil but data, and that in 2018, 5 of the 6 companies in the world, based on market valuations, are data companies, and you don't have to be a genius to guess. We're talking Facebook, Google, Microsoft, so on and so forth. And it costs money to capture and process data, so there's a cost as well as a benefit, and it's a completely valuable asset. If you think of companies like Amazon that are now moving into all sorts of different areas, they're talking about having supermarkets and shopping, but it's all basically because they've got a very efficient way of processing that data, very good analytics and so on, which then data can be used therefore as a way of promoting and growing that business. But on the other hand, you've always got to say, you've always got to be cognizant of the rules of GDPR, which lays down certain rules in terms of how you get the data in the first place, security of the data, being open and transparent with the data subject, so on and so forth. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, a very valuable asset, but equally there are rules that go with it, as with all assets, just like with money in banking, there's just tons and tons of regulation. Thanks, Stelios. Okay, so in terms of the types of personal data, if just from a broad brush point of view, every company is going to have 2 main types of personal data, regardless of what sort of industry that you're in. So one is going to be customer data. And if you say, for example, if you worked in the health service, you wouldn't call it customer data, you'd call it patient data, but it's data with somebody external who's an individual with whom you're interacting. So that's one major type of personal data. The other one is employee data, which quite often when people are looking at GDPR, they tend to neglect the employee data. But actually, in my experience, a lot of litigation in terms of breaches of GDPR tend to come from employees, disgruntled employees. So you've always got to think of an internal aspect of personal data, employee, and an external one, which is customer. So those are the main 2 categories, although there are other subcategories and there may be other organizations that you interact with. Legislation and regulation. Again, I'll just a very quick thing to put in the back of your minds is that there are 2 pieces of regulation that you need to consider when you're dealing with data. GDPR, which I've spoken about, but there's also another piece of regulation called PECR, which is Privacy Electronic Communication Regulation. And this regulation is the one that you see in practice when you go onto a website and you see we are using cookies. Do you consent for us to use cookies? And the marketing using personal data. So the actual, in order to do marketing with personal data, you actually need consent. So there are 2 different pieces of regulation, although GDPR is the predominant one. PECR is the one that covers marketing of electronic data, and it's the one that you most see when you see cookies, or you get an email from somebody and you don't particularly understand why they've got your information, but there's always an unsubscribe button on the email, and that's because you need consent to do that. So those two pieces of regulation come hand in hand. There's also another piece, which is the Data Protection Act of 2018, which incorporates GDPR, but it also covers the processing of criminal data, immigration data, journalists, and so on. So unless you're in those sort of fields, in the main area of compliance, and I'm probably repeating myself in terms of the challenges, it's probably the biggest challenge now is just the massive data that you tend to have. There's a massive data. It might be stored in different ways. It depends. It's more of a challenge if you're an older organization. It's more of a challenge if, although it's a benefit, as I said earlier, it's more of a challenge if you're dealing with purely data, as opposed to an organization that, say, for example, might make things and the data follows the actual production. So some organizations are primarily data focused and others are less so, but all organizations process data. Thanks, Stylianos. Okay, so the GDPR, the one thing you need to recognize at this stage is that there are no two GDPRs, believe it or not. So everybody will recoil in disgust when I mention the word Brexit, because nobody wants to talk about it anymore. But one of the effects of Brexit was that there is now a UK GDPR and an EU GDPR. They're exactly the same, but you've now got two jurisdictions in terms of data transferring between the UK and the EU. So the GDPR is exactly the same as it ever was. It's just now called UK GDPR, and it's not a revolution in data protection. That's the other important point to take into account. So the Data Protection Act of 1996 was not, 1998 is not really very different from GDPR. So GDPR is an evolution in data protection law, not a revolution. But what got people exercised about GDPR was literally the level of fines that could be put on a company. So under the old Data Protection Act, you know, a serious breach, you might get fined £50,000. A serious breach under GDPR can be multi-millions, if not in theory it could be billions, but probably in practice not. So there's a whole different amount of negativity in terms of breaching GDPR. The other thing you need to think about as well is that there are now legal companies who are doing class lawsuits on behalf of data subjects where there's been breaches. So you may get a fine from the authorities for breaching GDPR. You may be sued personally by the data subject. And also the other thing is that the potential is you lose business reputation, and every time there's some negativity, for example, about Facebook, the share price drops. So GDPR is a slight catching up to date in terms of data protection legislation. It's also consistent across all countries in the EU, so it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same in the UK, so there was an element of consolidation. And the reason it was put in place was primarily that consolidation, keeping up with between the last Data Protection Act and 2018 when GDPR came in, was to catch up with the likes of Facebook, Google, and all that type of social media, which wasn't around when the previous Data Protection Act was put in place. Its scope, and again, this is another point that you need to take into account, is that if you've got companies in Europe, its scope applies to any EU citizen regardless of where the processing is done. So, for example, if you're a US company and you're processing EU citizens' data, then that will be covered by GDPR, albeit that it will be processed in the United States. So it's got a territorial aspect in terms of it covers the EU, but it's got a wider aspect in as much that it's any EU citizens' data, regardless of where it's processed. PECI I've just mentioned, that's what covers marketing data. So in other words, if you want to send marketing, even with your own customers, you still may need consent. So if you've got an existing customer, the customer still got the right to withdraw consent and not accept any marketing. Okay, Stylianos? Okay, so there are three main components in terms of the players in terms of GDPR. So one is something called the data controller. So this is the organization that is the one that decides on the rules in terms of how the data is processed. The data processor is somebody who acts on behalf of the data controller to process the data. So the best example I can give you is, say, for example, financial data, where you may subcontract the payroll functioning to another organization. So as you'll be the data controller because it's your employees. The data processor, which may be an accountancy firm or a payroll firm, will be the data processor, but it's still incumbent on the data controller to set the rules for the data processor. And you do have situations as well where there could be a sub-processor. So I've worked with companies that are data processors, but then they may subcontract some of the processing to another, and that's a sub-processor. So those are the two main stakeholders, if you like, from a GDPR perspective. And then you have the regulator. So in the United Kingdom, the regulator is the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO. So they're sort of like the police in terms of all of this. You can report breaches to the ICO, they can do investigations, they help with policy, guidance, so on and so forth. So they're the regulator. So you're either going to be the data controller purely as a data controller because you don't contract out any processing, or you may be a data controller who subcontracts to a data processor, or you may be a company that just is a data processor. There are sometimes situations where you have things like joint data controllers. For example, in the public sector, you might get a NHS organisation and a local council that jointly process data, and that's called a joint data controller. Repercussions of non-compliance, three main things to formulate in your minds. You could be fined massively if it's a severe breach. You could be sued by the data subject, but more importantly, from a business perspective, it's always reported in the news, so you lose business reputation. And also, it now becomes a factor when you're trying to win contracts with organisations. One of the questions they may ask is, how many breaches have you had? Or, what controls, how do you adhere to compliance? So it's both a regulatory perspective and also a business perspective, because you don't want to fall foul of the rules. Okay, thanks, Stylianos. Okay, so some of this is a little bit arcane, so I'll just skip over it. But the distinction between a regulation, which GDPR is, and the R in GDPR is regulation, and a directive, which is what the previous Data Protection Act incorporated, is that a directive says to EU states, we want to do this data protection stuff, but we'll sort of leave it up to you in terms of how you apply it. A regulation, on the other hand, says, I want you to apply this data protection legislation, and I want you to do it consistently, such that it's what they call they actually refer to data, believe it or not, data subjects as like a human right. It actually says that in GDPR regulation. That, so in other words, just as the EU has got, you know, no barriers in terms of human movement, it's also set up to have no barriers in terms of data movement. So therefore, the regime has to be consistent across each country. And at the moment, the UK is exactly the same as the EU GDPR, but my bet is it will start to differ in the years to come. But at the moment, it's exactly the same. It was adopted in 27th of April 2016, and then there was a process of consultation and getting people up to speed before it became law on the 25th of May 2018. It's broken down into chapters and articles, so it will always quote Article 30 or chapter something. So that's just the legal way they've broken it down. And as I said earlier, it's evolution in data protection, not revolution. So some of the things I found when I've been doing GDPR compliance, especially in the financial sector, is that because GDPR is just slight changes, then when I've gone in to do GDPR compliance, the actual activity should have been fairly slim and not much to do. But what I found was that a lot of these organizations were never compliant with the Data Protection Act of 1998, and therefore there was 20 years work to do, rather than you know, just getting up to speed. Thanks, Stylianos. Okay, so just a quick summary of probably what I've said so far is that it applies to personal data, but it's got a wider definition of what personal data is. So it's anything that can identify an individual. It gives the individual not total control, but a lot of control over their own data. So there are all sorts of data subjects' rights which have to be stated to the data subject. So it's far more transparent than it used to be. Social media, as I said earlier, has had an impact on the impetus to bring in GDPR. Standard set of rules across Europe, and within the EU there are regulators within each country. So Germany will have its own regulator, Hungary, France, so on and so forth, and it's consistent throughout the EU because it's a regulation and it's not a directive. And the rights and responsibilities are really defined. So the push of data of this GDPR is to say, here data subjects, we want to tell you these are your rights over your own personal data, and this is what you can do. So if anybody's ever had either put in or received as a company a data subject access request, it's a right of an individual to say, I want you to give me all the data that you hold about me. So you may have come across this particular one. Now, the only way to avoid GDPR, if I can put it that way, there are two ways you can do it. One, it doesn't apply to dead people, so I'm not suggesting you kill all your employees and customers to avoid it, but it doesn't apply to dead people. And if you anonymize the data, which is a way of making the data such that it cannot be identified to an individual. So if, for example, you're doing analytics, you don't have to actually put the personal data in, or you're a clinical trials company, you could anonymize the data such that it no longer becomes personal data and therefore escapes GDPR. But it depends on the nature of the business, and there are not many organizations that can actually do that. And finally, this is another important point, it's exactly the same principles in GDPR as the previous Data Protection Act, and those principles have been consistent since the 1950s when data protection was first starting to come about. But it's now added this thing called accountability principle, which means that not only do you have to comply with GDPR, but you have to prove that you're complying with it. So this leads to having a number of things in place, primarily policies and procedures. So in other words, you have to prove that you're complying. You could be the best in the world in terms of not falling foul of GDPR, but if you don't have the documentation to support it and there was a breach, then it would be very difficult to defend. So this thing is called the accountability principle. Okay, thanks, Stylianos. Okay, very quickly on this, there are 7 principles, of which the accountability principle I just mentioned, and most of these principles have been consistent across data protection. It's all about making sure you've got the right purpose, processing the data, having a lawful basis, making sure the data is secure, making sure the data is accurate, giving rights to the individual, so on and so forth. I'll just pick, because we're running out of time, I'll just pick particular items from this slide just to give you a little bit more focus. So there's this concept called data protection by design and default. Now, this is a part of GDPR that says if you're designing some system or process, you have to include and take account of data protection whilst you're designing the system. So in other words, it's saying put the controls in place whilst ahead of the system being deployed. So it's a concept called data design and by default, and it would apply a lot to software companies that are just designing software. So if you were a software company providing software and you were trying to sell to another company, third party, the first question they should ask if they're taking into account GDPR is, have you designed the system by data protection by design and default? Okay. Another one I'll pick out here, which is data, the one in red. Data protection is a regime, not a one-off compliance. So a lot of mistakes that were made when GDPR came in was that a lot of consultants, I won't mention them, but you know, the big 5 consultancies, they came in and said, right, well, we've got these changes, so we'll amend your policies to reflect GDPR changes. So that's sort of one level of compliance, but actually what the ICO would expect and what your data subjects would expect is that GDPR is a living thing. It's an operational thing within your business. So you have to make sure that you, even if you write a policy, that you're actually signing up to that policy and it's working in practice. And probably the most dynamic element of this is, and the biggest risk from a data protection point of view, is cybersecurity and cyber attacks, because that's an ongoing day-to-day thing. So that would be one element that you might have to make sure that you've got all your IT controls in place, antivirus up to date, VPN, two-factor authentication, all those sort of controls in place. And they're on a day-to-day operational side. So the point I'm making is that it has to be a day-to-day operational activity. Just for example, like health and safety, you may have a health and safety policy, but equally, you're always looking out to try and avoid accidents. So that's probably one of the things that you need to take into account. Okay, thanks, Stylianos. Okay, there are 7 principles underpinning GDPR. So when you get into GDPR, you can get into some really technical stuff, some really legal stuff, and you can start to, you look at all the policies you need, and you can start thinking, well, I'm losing the thread here. I just don't understand this technicality. So you always need to come back to these 7 principles that are not new to GDPR, as I said earlier, the common to all, the evolution of data protection. And these 7 principles underpin everything. So in other words, if you're a company that's got a mission statement in terms of your business, you put this mission statement out, and you would always keep going back to it to reflect on how are we doing against the mission statement. So this is sort of a mission statement for GDPR. And the first one is that you process the data lawfully, fairly, and transparently. So in other words, you collect the data in the way you're supposed to collect it. So the negative side of this was really organizations like Facebook and so on, hoovering up data, and you didn't even know they got your personal data. So you have to be transparent and get the data from a source that's lawful and transparent. Second one is that it's only collected for a specific legitimate purpose. So for example, if you're an employee or you're a company with employees, there's certain data that you need to collect in order to pay them, in order to manage them and so on. But there might be other data that is not relevant to that employment. So it could be, you know, you don't want to ask them, you know, I don't know, like what hobbies have you got, so on and so forth, because you could argue that you don't need that data for the purpose of employing that individual. GDPR is a very minimalist sort of approach to data. So it's all about keeping things to the minimum you need to process, the minimum length of time to keep it. So it's all very minimalist. So the third one is what is necessary to process the data. So in other words, you'll see if you go on websites where there'll be data that you have to fill in, and then there'll be stuff that's optional. So the optional, if you fill it in, then de facto you've given your consent to do it. But it's basically saying only collect the data that's relevant for the processing and the industry that you're in. Number 4 is quite a difficult one. It really comes under the banner of data quality. So we're talking about, it's a fundamental right for a data subject who's either a customer or an employee, for example, that the data you've got about them is accurate and up to date. So in other words, if you and no, it's slightly different now because you've got a lot of apps. So even banking's got apps, and you can maintain your own personal data. But if you've got a less up-to-date system, and you email someone and say you've got my address wrong, or you've got my email address wrong, it's incumbent on that company that holds the data under GDPR Principle 4 that they have to make sure that that data is accurate and up to date. So we're into the realms of data quality, and that really, the quality of data is really depends on what sort of industry you're doing, how you process it, how much you take. So there's no one sort of solution. You have to look at the individual circumstances. Number 5 is you only store it for as long as possible. So for each type of data, you have to let the data subject know how long you're going to keep that data for. If it's certain types of data, for example, sales data, for example, which is financial data, then HMRC will dictate that you have to keep it for 6 years anyway. So in that sense, you've no choice. That has to be minimum 6 years. But other sorts of data, and in a sense, it's a business decision. And you can argue your corners, say, well, I think this type of data should be held 5 years or 3 years. What you can't do is not make that decision in advance. So in other words, for each type of data, in advance, you have to say, this is how long we're going to keep it. You can't just decide, well, I'll keep it. You never know, it might come in useful. Okay. Then the 6th one, this is where you link in with cybersecurity. So the security of the data and the integrity and confidentiality. So in other words, you've got to make sure that the data is protected. It's available when the data subject needs it. So in other words, you know, the system's not crashing down for weeks on end, and that it's not being accessed by people who it shouldn't be. So these core principles actually all make common sense. If you think about what I said earlier, that the data doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the data subject. So these are just saying, if you're collecting personal data, these are the principles that you have to adhere to. And accountability is the latest principle added, which says you have to prove that you're doing all these things rather than, yeah, we're doing it and we've never had a breach, so therefore everything's okay. So it's a little bit like going back to my car analogy at the very beginning. You don't have to just be able to drive the car. You have to pass a test to prove that you know how to drive the car. Okay, Stylianos? Okay, so a number of key things, which I'll just go over very broadly, that this is your evidence, this is your accountability of what you can produce as evidence that you are complying. So a record of processing activities, basically listing all the different personal data items and saying, this is the lawful basis upon which we're processing this data. And to be honest with you, it's a key document for the ICO. They'll ask for that document if they don't ask for anything else. So it's very easy to do. And that goes into your privacy policy, which you put on the website, which is your message to the outside world. This is the data we're collecting. This is the lawful basis. This is why we're taking it. Data processing contracts with any clients that you, so in other words, if you subcontract processing, you should always have a contract in place stipulating the terms upon which they're processing that data. Data flow mapping and information asset registers are your internal recording of how does the data flow in and outside of the organization. And these information assets are things like systems, spreadsheets, Word documents, emails. How do we store that data? So in other words, the analogy is a bit like, you know, how many cars have we got in our transport fleets? Those are the information asset registers. And where do we drive them, which is like your data flow mapping. And a number of component parts that internally you need to define roles and responsibilities. It depends on the size of the company. Small companies, you can crystallize this in a much less elongated way. Policies and procedures, you need to state, this is what we intend to do. This is part of your evidence. Controls in terms of who has access to the systems, how do we check nothing's going wrong? Cybersecurity, everybody needs cybersecurity. The smallest one-man company needs some level of cybersecurity, and it can be a very cheap solution. You put in a VPN, you make sure you've got some antivirus. You know, you can spend, a one-man company can spend about £200 to make sure that as you can store data in the cloud. So a very cheap way of ensuring cybersecurity, but it depends on the size of the organization and the type of data, because some organizations, fintechs, banks, that's where the hackers are going to go, because that's where the rewards are. Monitoring and auditing is just to make sure that all these things you say you're doing are actually happening. So if you were ever to have a breach, all of these component parts would be what the ICO would look to see that are going on. Incident management is an incident is different to a breach. So an incident you should be recording. It's a bit like a near miss under health and safety. So it's saying, we had an incident, it could have led to a breach, but we managed to, you know, just by luck or whatever, to stop it. So you record all these incidents and you're looking at ways of tightening up the controls and making sure that, I mean, I had an example today, to be honest. Facebook's the easiest one that seems to get hacked. So I had some Facebook friends sending me these messages through Messenger. And as soon as you say click on a link, you never do that. So that would be something like in a company, oh, it's an incident. It nearly resulted in something, but it didn't. But send out a message, everybody beware, there's something funny going on with Facebook. So that's sort of incident management. Data subject right processing, that's to make sure that any requests you get from the data subject are handled within the rules. And the key thing you have to think about is that you've got 30 days to respond to a data subject. So it can be a very simple answer that takes you a day, but it might be more convoluted. You can exceed the 30 days, but you have to keep the data subject informed. Contracts, you have to think about data protection in contracts. So you always have to mention something about data protection, because there will be some data in terms of your interaction with whomever. And risk assessment is actually, risk assessment, you could argue, is a core pillar of it all, because if you were to ask me, how do we make ourselves 100% compliant? I would say, shut down your business. That's the only way you're going to be 100% compliant, because that's the only risk zero state that you can get in. So everything is a risk. You know, the bigger you get, the more successful you get, then the risk goes up. So all you can do is mitigate the risk with controls. So risk assessment is constantly monitoring that, but there's no such thing as total compliance, and there's no such thing as zero risk. Okay, Stylianos? Okay, I think that's probably it as a quick whistle-stop tour. I may have exceeded the time scales, but apologies for that. But I hope you just got a grasp of some of it.
Yeah, I think it was very useful, and we're definitely on time. We apologize for any technical issues caused. I was hoping we would also say a few things about data strategy, but I'm afraid we might run over time. We are also, however, I mentioned on the chat that we do run sessions on data strategy, and we have some free tools and frameworks for anyone interested. So I think maybe in the remaining 10-15 minutes, maybe we can answer some of the questions, of which we have plenty. So one question is, are there industry good practices which aren't in GDPR law, such as ethics, etc.?
Ethics doesn't really come into data protection. It might become one of the, depending on what you're in and interact with other organizations, then it might be one of the things that, so in other words, if you're interacting with another company, they might ask for a series of things. GDPR compliance could be cybersecurity controls, and it might be ethics, and another one obviously is environment. But there's no direct correlation between ethics and data protection. I mean, ethics sort of underpins it in the sense that it's written from a data as a human right to an individual, but it doesn't evolve into anything more than that in terms of application.
Great. Wait, more questions coming in. So another very interesting question is, can a data subject relinquish their rights once a release form agreement has been signed? For instance, when data is published.
So can you say that last bit again?
So can a data subject relinquish their rights once a release form agreement has been signed? For instance, when data is published. And can a data processor retain a data subject's randomized or anonymized activity, analytics, and user behavior? So I guess the question is whether someone can completely relinquish ownership of their data once they've signed something on a website. I guess this is what this question is.
The short answer is that you never relinquish your rights. You're not asked to do. When you pass data to someone else via a website, whatever, you're giving them the right to process the data, but you're not giving them the right to own the data. So you're never actually relinquishing your rights, and that whoever you send it to has to comply with those principles. So it's not a case of relinquishing your rights. You never have to do that. And sorry, the second part of the question was?
Can a data processor retain a data subject's randomized or anonymized activity, analytics, and user behavior? Which I guess this means that if someone's data is anonymized, then can a data processor just keep it?
Yeah, as soon as data is anonymized, it completely bypasses GDPR. So the GDPR rules no longer apply.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Another question is, which I think it might have been answered during the presentation, I'm not sure, is who audits the companies to ensure that they're GDPR compliant?
No one will ever audit a company in advance to say they're compliant. You will get an audit if there's a breach and it's serious. The ICO will then come in and audit you. Occasionally, the ICO, under consent, might say, we're trying to do some research. Do you mind if we do an audit? Just so they might come to an industry that they don't know too much about and say, do you mind if we come in? And it's really for them to find out a bit more about data protection with that in this industry, but no one will actually come in and audit you. You may get an audit, you may have, strangely enough, I covered this just this afternoon, believe it or not. So you might get a company that you're dealing with that you're doing some data exchange, and they may say, especially if you're the processor, well, we want to audit you because we've put in the contract that you must comply with GDPR, but we actually have to prove. So they may put into the contract that they'll come and audit you, but then it's still up to you to decide whether you sign that contract. So there'll probably be more and more of that, but there's no actual legal requirement, nothing within GDPR that says you have to be audited by X, Y, and Z, in the same way that, say, financial accounts need to be audited.
Perfect. And I guess this ties in with the next question, which is who decides whether it is anonymized sufficiently? So I guess what you just described pretty much answers this question as well, correct?
Yeah, the thing about anonymization, you also have this three types of state of data. You've got pure personal data, an interim stage which is called pseudonymized, which means that it's sort of semi-anonymized, but you can still identify the data subject by adding another piece of data, but that data is kept separate. So in other words, again, it's strangely enough, I was talking about this very subject this afternoon. So if you send payroll data to be processed, you wouldn't necessarily have to put the person's name on. You could just put a number, because the payroll company doesn't need to know who the individual is. They just need to know that this person, this sort of money, and blah blah. So that would be pseudonymized. Anonymized is where there's just no hint. There's not even any personal data in it, such that you could even glean who that was. So analytics companies in particular, I was talking to one last week, in fact, that do just that. And my discussion with them was, make sure that you don't receive any personal data, because sometimes some of it slips through, especially they were getting some data, for example, in CSV files, and sometimes a bit of personal data would slip through. So we're saying you need to put in a control to not accept that, such that you know all the data coming in is anonymized. So for analytics, you don't need to know the personal data necessarily.
Yep. I think that's a great point. And I agree with this as a data scientist. You don't always care about the underlying person for most use cases in analytics, whether you're talking about simpler models or whether we're talking about artificial intelligence and machine learning. And finally, the last question is by Marcy. How is compliance demonstrated or proved or documented?
Compliance will be documented. I think on one of the early slides, there are these different stages. So if I was to come into a company, there's two sort of answers to this. The ICO have recently, when I say recently, within the last few months, they produced something called an accountability framework. So in other words, this framework, it's a list of questions that covers everything to do with GDPR. And it says, have you got this? Have you got this? Have you got this? So if you use that framework, you could prove that you're compliant to the ICO standards. The only problem is that, like at the end of the day, the ICO is a bureaucracy. And sometimes stuff that comes out of bureaucracies are sort of a little bit over the top in terms of the documentation, the process. So that's one way, but I would only advise doing that if you're a particular size company, because it can be a little bit bureaucratic and a little bit too much of an overhead. So if it's a smaller company, I go through these different, if you call them pillars of GDPR. So the first is governance. Have you got roles and responsibilities such that you've got somebody who's actually in control of this data? The second one, have you got policies and procedures? Because that's a good piece of evidence. And sometimes proof of compliance, if you're dealing with another company, that may be all they ask for. Have you got such a policy? Have you got such a policy? And they'll leave it at that. The next thing is, which again sometimes gets forgotten, is training and awareness. So in other words, if you've got a policy but the staff don't know about it and they don't understand it, then you've not made that policy a living thing. When I mentioned earlier on that it has to be GDPR has to be operational, then that training and awareness. So a lot of companies that I advise, I would say, make sure people are trained in, even if it's just an hour's training on basic GDPR before you give them access to the system. And you might only have to do that once a year. So training and awareness is another part of it. And then you've got the monitoring of it to make sure that it's all happening. And then you've got what I'll call aberrations. So things going wrong, which are incidents through an incident management system, which may lead on to a breach, and audit. So you've got those pillars in place, making it a living thing. That's more than enough to prove compliance. But as I say, there are organisations that will only ever ask for the policies. I've done a lot of work where a lot of organisations don't understand GDPR, and they only activate when somebody asks them for certain things. So they may come to me and say, we've been asked for all this stuff to win this contract, and I just produce all the policies. So the sort of compliance at one level, but it's not a real compliance.
Perfect. I think this pretty much covers everything, and we're pretty much on time. It's 6 o'clock. So I think this was a very interesting session, and I believe everyone found it very engaging based on the number of questions we received tonight. So thanks everyone for participating. Thank you, Tom, for the very interesting presentation. If you have any more questions, or if you want to learn more about some of our events on topics such as data strategy, entrepreneurship, blockchain, AI, make sure to sign up to our mailing list, and also please make sure to send an email to the address I just typed in the chat, so you can also get a free copy of the Decision Makers Handbook Data Science. So thanks everyone, and have a good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Stylianos.
Thank you. Bye-bye.